Foreign officer ordered a royal guard to salute, but the guard's reaction shook the embassy. The day started like any other at the prestigious embassy, but today was different. There was a quiet buzz in the air, a sense of anticipation that everyone could feel. A high-ranking foreign officer was about to arrive. This was not just any regular visit, this one was special. He was from a powerful country, and his presence was meant to mark an important moment in diplomatic relations. The embassy had been preparing for weeks, making sure everything was perfect for his arrival. The grand halls of the embassy were decorated with flags, floral arrangements, and golden trim on the walls that glimmered in the sunlight. The air was filled with excitement as embassy staff moved quickly, making last-minute adjustments to ensure everything was in order. They had been told to expect a man of authority and presence, and it was clear that every person at the embassy had their role to play in this important day. Among all the people working, there was one who stood out in particular, the royal guard. Standing tall in his ceremonial uniform, he was a symbol of the country's honor. His uniform was a perfect blend of history and tradition. The sharpness of his outfit, with the polished buttons, crisp lines, and shining boots, reflected the pride of the royal family he served. He was known for his discipline and his unwavering dedication to his duties. This guard had been in the service for years. He had stood watch at many royal events, had witnessed countless dignitaries pass through the embassy, but today, he felt a strange feeling he hadn't felt in a long time, nervousness. It wasn't fear but rather the weight of the responsibility he carried. Today, his small but crucial role in the embassy's tradition would be tested in a way he hadn't expected. The foreign officer was punctual. The embassy staff stood in place, greeting him with a respectful bow. He looked every bit the part of a powerful official, his tailored suit, cold eyes, and strong presence commanded attention. He walked with purpose, his every step sending a silent message that he was in charge. As the officer entered the embassy's main hall, all eyes were on him, and everything seemed to pause for a moment. It was at this moment that the foreign officer made a decision that caught everyone off guard. Without hesitation, he turned to the royal guard standing at attention by the door. He gave a sharp, almost demanding command, "Salute." The guard's expression didn't change. His eyes remained forward, his body still as stone. He knew his role, he understood his duties better than anyone. But this command, coming from a foreign officer who didn't understand the depth of what he was asking, made him pause. A salute wasn't just a sign of respect, it was a gesture that held deep meaning. It symbolized more than just authority, it reflected mutual recognition between individuals of equal importance. It was a symbol of honor. For a brief moment, there was silence. The officer, seeing that the guard hadn't moved, repeated the command more forcefully, "Salute." His voice echoed in the hall, drawing the attention of everyone present. The room, once filled with murmurs of anticipation, now became unnervingly quiet. The staff members, who had been standing nearby, exchanged nervous glances. Some wondered why the guard hadn't obeyed immediately. They knew him well, and they knew how disciplined he was. Yet, in this moment, he stood unmoved, his posture as rigid as ever. To some, it felt like an act of defiance. But to the guard, it was far more than that. The embassy staff was unsure how to react. Most had never seen a situation like this. The foreign officer, now standing just a few feet from the guard, seemed to be growing irritated. He expected compliance, yet here was this young man who refused to bend. His face, usually calm and composed, now showed signs of impatience. For a brief second, the guard's mind raced. He could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on him, but he remained still. The foreign officer was an outsider, someone who had no understanding of the sacred customs of this country. He had no idea that the royal guard's duty went beyond simple obedience. It was about pride, honor, and a deep sense of responsibility to the royal family. The salute wasn't just a formality, it was a gesture that held meaning far beyond its physical form. In the silence, the guard's thoughts turned to the oath he had taken years ago when he first joined the royal service. He had sworn to protect the traditions and values that had been passed down through generations. He knew his role in society, and while he was always respectful of the rules, he also knew when they were being misunderstood or misused. This was one of those moments. The foreign officer's gaze never wavered. "Salute," he ordered once again, his tone now laced with authority. But the guard, standing as immovable as a statue, did not flinch. His eyes were still forward, unwavering, as though he could feel the weight of his duty pressing against his shoulders. The tension in the room began to grow thicker, the air heavy with uncertainty. In the back of the room, the ambassador, who had been silently observing the exchange, began to realize the gravity of the situation. He stepped forward with a calm but firm presence, his hand raised slightly in a gesture of authority. The embassy staff instinctively parted, making way for the ambassador as he approached the officer. "Sir," the ambassador said in a polite, but serious tone. "I think there may be some misunderstanding." He turned to the guard and nodded respectfully. The salute is a traditional gesture of honor and respect. It is not simply a command to be followed without context. The foreign officer's frown deepened, but he was silent. He didn't fully understand what was being said, but he could feel the tension in the room. The ambassador, sensing the confusion, continued, "In this country, the royal guard's role is more than just a ceremonial duty. Their actions are guided by a deeper code of conduct, which cannot always be understood by outsiders." The officer's expression softened slightly, but he still didn't fully grasp the importance of the situation. "I didn't mean to offend," he said, though his voice was tinged with frustration. The ambassador nodded. "It is not about offense, sir. It is about understanding. The royal guard is not just an ordinary soldier. His refusal to salute is not a sign of disrespect to you. It is a reflection of his duty to uphold the traditions and honor of this country." The foreign officer, now realizing the complexity of the situation, felt a wave of embarrassment wash over him. He had expected a simple exchange of protocol, but instead, he had inadvertently stepped into a moment of cultural significance that he had not prepared for. For a long moment, the foreign officer stood silently, his mind processing the ambassador's words. He then turned to the royal guard, who remained standing at attention. His face softened, and he nodded slightly in acknowledgement of the deeper meaning behind the guard's actions. The room, once filled with tension, slowly began to breathe again. The ambassador's intervention had defused the situation, but the consequences of the moment lingered. The officer now understood that there were layers of meaning to the small but significant gestures that had initially seemed so simple. And as for the royal guard, he stood silently, his commitment to duty unshaken. He knew that in moments like this, his actions spoke louder than words ever could. His silence had told a story of tradition, honor, and the strength of a deep-rooted loyalty that could never be broken. The embassy staff watched with bated breath as the situation unfolded in front of them. The foreign officer stood silently, his eyes now focused on the royal guard. The guard remained in place, his posture unwavering and his gaze forward, as though the world around him had faded away. The tension in the room was thick, like the stillness just before a storm. The ambassador, standing between the two men, could feel the eyes of everyone in the room upon him. He had to handle this carefully. The diplomatic mission that had brought the foreign officer to the embassy was crucial. The officer represented not only himself but the interests of an entire nation. Yet, the ambassador understood that diplomacy was not just about official speeches and handshakes, it was about understanding the cultures and values that shaped people's actions. The foreign officer, still processing what the ambassador had explained, stood with a confused frown. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially in a situation where he had expected complete compliance. He had been trained to command, not to understand every nuance of foreign customs. His initial anger was now mixed with a sense of humility and confusion. He glanced at the guard again, his eyes searching for some sign of movement, something that would tell him the guard understood his mistake. But there was nothing, just silence. The officer let out a deep breath, trying to calm himself, but the discomfort in the room only grew. The embassy staff shifted uncomfortably, whispering amongst themselves in hushed tones. The situation had escalated from a simple misunderstanding to a public spectacle. There was no way to turn back now. The ambassador turned to the officer, his voice calm but firm. The royal guard's role is not just ceremonial. His actions represent something much deeper, something you may not fully understand at this moment. It's a bond of duty, respect, and tradition. This salute is not simply a gesture of obedience. It is an expression of mutual recognition, a symbol of honor that is sacred in this country. The foreign officer's brow furrowed. He was a man of authority, a man who had always given orders that were followed without question. This guard's refusal to salute, in his eyes, felt like an affront to his position. He wasn't used to being ignored. The officer opened his mouth to speak, but then paused. The weight of the ambassador's words settled on him. He realized that this was about more than just a simple military salute, it was about understanding something far more profound. The ambassador could see the officer's struggle, the inner conflict playing out behind his sharp, calculating eyes. The officer had clearly never encountered such a situation before. The ambassador spoke again, softly this time. It's not personal. It's about respect. You have to understand that in this country, honor is not something that can be commanded. It's earned, through understanding, through respect. The officer exhaled sharply, finally starting to comprehend the depth of what he was being told. He looked again at the young royal guard. The man hadn't moved, hadn't shown any signs of irritation or impatience, just standing perfectly still. His demeanor was calm, but there was an undeniable strength in his silence. For a moment, everything seemed to pause. The air was still, the weight of the situation hanging in the balance. The embassy staff, watching from a distance, exchanged nervous glances. They, too, understood the significance of this moment. The guard's refusal to salute wasn't an act of disrespect, but a silent protest, a reminder that there was more to being a soldier than just following orders. It was about preserving something that couldn't be easily explained or understood by outsiders. The ambassador stepped forward, placing a hand gently on the officer's arm. Perhaps it would be best to give him a moment, he suggested, his voice kind but firm. The officer nodded slowly, the realization of his mistake beginning to sink in. He stepped back, allowing the guard to remain at attention. In the silence that followed, the embassy staff fell into a deep, reflective quiet. The royal guard had not only stood his ground in a way that no one had expected, but he had also subtly taught a valuable lesson in the power of cultural traditions. For all the formality and grandeur of diplomatic events, the most important lessons were often the quietest, the ones that could not be seen, but only felt. As the minutes ticked by, the officer's mind raced. He had always viewed diplomacy in terms of power, control, and influence, but now he was beginning to see the delicate balance required to truly understand another culture. His frustration had given way to humility. The guard, still standing at attention, had unknowingly opened his eyes to something far greater than the protocols of diplomacy, something that could not be reduced to simple orders. The embassy staff could sense the change in the air. The tension that had hung so thickly before seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet understanding. The officer, still standing off to the side, gave a small nod, acknowledging the guard's silence. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was a recognition. The officer understood now that the salute wasn't just an act of submission, but one of respect. And the guard, in his steadfastness, had taught him that some things could not be commanded, they had to be earned through understanding. The ambassador, seeing the shift in the officer's demeanor, smiled slightly. He knew that the situation had been diffused, but it wasn't over yet. There was still much to discuss. The officer had learned a lesson, but now it was time to begin a conversation about the deeper meaning of respect, duty, and tradition. The ambassador turned back to the officer, his voice gentle. I suggest that we sit down and discuss this further. There is much for you to learn about the customs of this country. It's not just about what happens in these walls. It's about understanding the people, their history, and what drives their actions. When you do, you'll find that your commands are not just followed, but embraced with respect. The officer nodded slowly, realizing that there was much more at stake here than he had initially thought. He was no longer just a man with authority, he was a guest in a foreign land, one that demanded understanding, not just compliance. It wasn't enough to simply give orders. He had to earn respect, just as the royal guard had. As the ambassador led the officer away from the room, the royal guard finally relaxed his posture, the tension lifting from his body. He had stood his ground, as was his duty, but now, he could feel the weight of the moment fading away. He had not only honored his role but had also, in his own quiet way, opened a door for a new understanding. The guard knew his actions had been noticed, but it was the quiet strength of his silence that had truly spoken volumes. The embassy staff, still processing what had happened, began to return to their duties. The visit would go on as planned, but something had changed in the air. The officer's journey had just begun, but for the royal guard, it was another day serving his country with dignity. And for everyone in that room, the memory of this quiet confrontation would stay with them long after the diplomat's visit had ended. As the officer and ambassador moved away from the royal guard, the air in the room seemed to grow still, like the calm after a storm. The embassy staff watched from the sidelines, still unsure of what had just unfolded. The royal guard, standing silently at attention, was a symbol of dignity and loyalty, yet what had just happened wasn't something anyone had expected. The officer, still processing the events, followed the ambassador through the ornate hallways of the embassy. As they walked, the ambassador spoke softly, his words meant to guide the officer, not reprimand him. You see, in this country, traditions are not just rules. They are a part of the soul of the people. The royal guard's actions aren't just about military protocol. It's about honor. It's about understanding the history of the land and the deep respect the people have for the royal family. The officer nodded slowly, his mind still caught in the events that had just transpired. He had been so focused on asserting authority, on maintaining the upper hand, that he hadn't considered the significance of his actions. He was a diplomat, a man of power and position, but in this moment, he felt small. His simple command, which he thought was a standard part of protocol, had unintentionally caused a cultural rift. The ambassador continued, sensing the officer's growing understanding. The royal guard has served this family for generations. His role is more than just a job. It's a commitment to the royal family and to the people. It's a bond that cannot be easily broken. For him, a salute isn't just about following orders, it's about the respect he holds for his country, for the people he protects, and for the traditions he upholds. The officer paused, his mind racing. He had assumed that his command to the guard had been reasonable. After all, he had seen this kind of protocol in his own country, where soldiers followed orders without question. But here, it was different. He was an outsider in a land with its own history, its own set of values, and its own expectations. I see now, the officer said slowly, his voice almost a whisper. I didn't understand. I thought a soldier's duty was simply to obey. But it's not just about obedience, is it? No, the ambassador replied, his tone thoughtful. It's about respect. And respect comes from understanding. The guard did not refuse you out of defiance. He simply couldn't salute because, in his eyes, that gesture is reserved for those who truly understand and honor the role he plays. It wasn't about you, but about the tradition. The officer felt a pang of guilt in his chest. He had come to the embassy with the intent to strengthen diplomatic ties, to represent his country with pride. But now, he realized that his actions, though well-intentioned, had nearly broken the fragile thread of understanding between the two nations. He had wanted to command respect, but instead, he had to learn how to earn it. As the ambassador led the officer into a quiet room, away from the bustle of the embassy, they sat down at a large, polished table. The ambassador poured tea into two fine porcelain cups and slid one toward the officer. The officer accepted it gratefully, but his mind was still spinning with the realization that the day's events were more complicated than he had ever anticipated. You see, the ambassador began, this country's history is rich with symbolism. Every gesture, every word, carries meaning. Even the smallest of actions can have a ripple effect. What seems like a small misunderstanding could have larger consequences if not understood in the right context. The officer, still feeling the weight of his misstep, sipped his tea slowly. He was beginning to understand, though the lesson was one he hadn't expected. So, the salute, it's not just a military formality. No, the ambassador said with a slight smile. It's much more. It's a symbol of trust, loyalty, and understanding. When a guard salutes, he acknowledges not just the person in front of him, but the larger institution that person represents. It's a recognition of mutual respect. The officer's eyes widened as the weight of the ambassador's words sank in. He had thought of diplomacy as a game of power, of negotiation, and leverage. But now, it felt more like a delicate dance, where every move had to be measured, every word chosen with care. He realized that this moment with the Royal Guard had taught him more than any official meeting or briefing ever could. "Do you think the Guard will ever salute me?" the officer asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. He almost sounded like a child asking for permission, but it was a question that had been on his mind since the Guard had stood before him, silent and unmoving. The ambassador's smile softened, and he looked at the officer with a gentle understanding. "Perhaps, but it will not be a matter of him simply obeying your command. It will take time. It will take understanding. And it will take mutual respect. That is the only way a salute can truly be meaningful." The officer sat back in his chair, his fingers gently tracing the edge of the teacup. It wasn't a simple thing to earn respect. It wasn't about power, titles, or the force of one's presence. It was about being willing to learn, to listen, and to understand the culture and values of those around you. And in this moment, the officer knew that he had much to learn. "I think I have a lot to learn," the officer admitted quietly, his voice sincere. "This has been a wake-up call. I thought I knew what I was doing, but now I see that there's more to this than just following protocol." The ambassador nodded, his eyes filled with wisdom. Every diplomat goes through this moment. It's not just about knowing the language of diplomacy, it's about understanding the language of the people you are working with. The deeper meaning behind the words, the gestures, and the actions. That's the true art of diplomacy. The officer nodded slowly, taking it all in. He had come to the embassy with one idea in mind, but now he was leaving with an entirely different perspective. It wasn't just about commanding respect. It was about earning it, through patience, understanding, and a willingness to engage with others on a deeper level. As the officer finished his tea, he stood up, ready to face the rest of the day. He knew that the situation with the Royal Guard wasn't over. He would have to approach it carefully, respectfully, and with an open mind. But one thing was clear, he was no longer just an outsider, demanding respect. He was now someone who understood the importance of culture, tradition, and honor. The ambassador stood as well, offering a final piece of advice. "Remember, respect is not given because you demand it. It is earned, slowly, over time, through understanding and mutual trust." The officer left the room with a newfound sense of humility. As he walked back toward the main hall of the embassy, he couldn't help but glance over at the royal guard, still standing at attention. The guard's silent strength now seemed even more powerful to him. The officer knew that, in time, he would be able to earn the respect of the guard. But first, he had to show that he understood what that respect truly meant. As the days passed, the foreign officer found himself in quiet reflection. He had come to the embassy with a mission to strengthen diplomatic ties, to assert his authority, and to represent his nation. But now, after the encounter with the royal guard, he was beginning to realize that diplomacy was far more than power and formalities. It was about understanding the complexities of other cultures, recognizing the value of traditions, and earning the respect of those around him. Each morning, the officer would pass by the royal guard on his way to meetings. The guard would always be standing at attention, his uniform crisp and his posture perfect, but the officer noticed something different in his demeanor now. There was no hostility, no resentment. Instead, there was a quiet strength that the officer could not ignore. The guard, though silent, had communicated volumes without speaking a word. The officer began to wonder how he could bridge the gap between them. He had learned much from the ambassador, but he knew that earning the guard's respect would take more than just understanding, it would take action. He had to show that he was willing to engage with the traditions of this land, that he was ready to learn and adapt. But where could he start? One morning, after a series of meetings, the officer found himself standing alone in the embassy's courtyard, looking out over the well-maintained garden. The warm sun bathed the area in golden light, and the gentle hum of the city outside seemed so far away. The peace of the moment offered him a chance to think clearly. He had spent so much of his life trying to control situations, pushing others to follow his lead, but now he saw how little he knew about the complexities of human relationships and respect. It was humbling, but it also gave him a sense of clarity. He had the power to change how things were, but only if he was willing to let go of his assumptions and approach people with a deeper understanding. The officer made a decision. He would speak to the royal guard not just as a commanding officer, but as a person who genuinely wanted to understand. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he felt it was the right step. He had already learned that words alone were not enough, his actions would have to speak louder than any command. The next day, after the morning meeting, the officer approached the royal guard, who was standing in his usual place near the entrance to the main hall. The guard's posture was perfect, and his eyes were fixed straight ahead, but this time, the officer didn't see it as an act of rigid obedience. He saw it as a moment of deep commitment to something far greater than just following orders. The officer cleared his throat, unsure of exactly what to say, but he knew this was a moment that couldn't be rushed. "Guard," he began, his voice calm but genuine, "I wanted to speak to you." The guard didn't move, but the officer didn't expect him to. Instead, he took a deep breath and continued, "I've spent some time thinking about our last encounter. And I realize now that I made a mistake." For the first time, the officer noticed the smallest shift in the guard's stance. It wasn't much, but it was enough for the officer to sense that the guard was listening. "I understand that what I asked of you wasn't just a formality. I understand now that the salute is something far deeper. It's not just a sign of obedience. It's a symbol of respect, of mutual understanding." The officer paused, choosing his words carefully. "And I want to earn that respect." The officer had expected the guard to remain as stoic as always, but this time, something was different. The guard's gaze, though still fixed ahead, seemed to soften just slightly. The officer could tell that the guard was processing his words, taking them in, considering them. "I've come to understand that respect is something that's earned, not commanded," the officer continued. "And I'm willing to do what it takes to show you that I respect your traditions. I respect what you stand for." The moment felt long, the officer's words hanging in the air between them. He had spoken from his heart, and now he felt a deep sense of vulnerability. This wasn't just about his position or his rank. It was about something more personal. It was about showing that he was ready to be a part of something bigger than himself, a part of a culture that valued tradition, loyalty, and honor. For a long while, the guard didn't respond. The officer could feel the weight of the silence, but he didn't step back. He didn't regret what he had said. If anything, it felt like the first honest conversation he had had since arriving. It wasn't about protocol. It wasn't about showing strength or dominance. It was about being human. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the guard spoke, his voice steady but soft. Respect is given when it is understood. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The officer nodded, understanding that the guard wasn't offering forgiveness or acceptance in that moment. Instead, the guard was acknowledging that the officer had taken the first step. There was still more to be done, but this was a beginning. "I'll keep that in mind," the officer said, his tone sincere. "Thank you." The guard didn't say another word, but the officer could feel that something had shifted. It wasn't a complete resolution, not yet, but it was a turning point. The officer knew that it would take time to prove his sincerity, time to show that he was ready to live up to the respect he had asked for. But this small exchange, this moment of understanding, was the foundation of something new. As the officer turned to leave, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had taken a step that was more important than any formal meeting or diplomatic exchange. He had shown vulnerability, and in return, he had received a quiet acknowledgement that spoke volumes. The days that followed were filled with new challenges, as the officer worked to strengthen his relationships with those around him. He made it a point to engage more deeply with the staff at the embassy, to listen to their stories, to learn about their lives and the values they held dear. He began to see that diplomacy wasn't just about formalities and agreements. It was about connection, understanding, and the willingness to grow. With each passing day, the officer grew more comfortable in his new role, not as a leader commanding respect, but as someone who was learning to earn it. He knew that he wasn't perfect, but he was committed to becoming a better diplomat, one who valued the traditions of others and who sought to build bridges instead of walls. As for the royal guard, the officer knew that there was still more work to be done. He wasn't sure when, but he hoped that one day, the guard would salute him not because it was required, but because he had earned it. And when that day came, it would be a moment of true respect, one that transcended rank and power, and spoke to the deeper bonds of understanding and mutual honor. Time passed, and with it, the foreign officer continued to adapt and learn. The embassy, once a place where he felt like an outsider, now felt like a second home. The walls of the grand building, adorned with the colors and symbols of both countries, began to feel less like barriers between him and the people of this land and more like symbols of connection. It wasn't just about the formal meetings anymore, it was about the small gestures, the everyday interactions, and the respect that grew from understanding. Each morning, he passed by the royal guard standing at attention. The guard, as always, was perfectly still, his uniform impeccable, his eyes fixed ahead. The officer had learned to appreciate the guard's presence in a new way. No longer did he see him as simply a soldier standing in place. Now, he saw the guard as a living embodiment of the country's values: loyalty, discipline, and honor. It was clear that the guard's position was not just a job but a calling. The officer began to realize that the guard was not just serving his royal family, he was serving the history and the people of this nation. The officer also understood that he couldn't simply demand respect, he had to live it. It wasn't about giving orders from the top down, but about showing the same respect to others that he expected from them. It was a subtle but powerful change in perspective. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but each day brought small steps forward. His interactions with the embassy staff were more thoughtful now. He took the time to listen, to learn from them, to engage in conversations that weren't about protocol or duties, but about their lives, their experiences, and their cultures. One day, as the officer was leaving his office after a long meeting, he spotted the royal guard in his usual place. This time, the officer didn't just walk past. He stopped. He was aware of the significance of this moment. For the first time, he didn't see a soldier he was supposed to command, he saw a person who had stood firm in his beliefs and his duty. The officer, his posture relaxed, walked up to the guard, his footsteps echoing softly in the quiet hall. The guard, as always, stood still. His eyes remained ahead, but this time, the officer didn't feel the need to break the silence with a command. Instead, he simply stood there for a moment, looking at the guard with a sense of understanding. It was a small gesture, but it felt important. For the first time, the officer didn't feel the need to assert his authority. He wasn't expecting anything, no salute, no formal exchange. He just stood there, silently acknowledging the guard's commitment, his role, and his quiet strength. The officer cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "I want to thank you," he said, his voice sincere but soft. "For everything. For your service, and for reminding me of what respect truly means." The guard didn't move, but the officer didn't expect him to. Instead, he watched as the smallest shift took place in the guard's posture. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was enough. The officer understood that this moment wasn't about grand gestures or immediate forgiveness. It was about something deeper, a quiet acknowledgement of shared respect. The officer nodded and turned to walk away, but as he took his first step, the guard, for the first time, did something unexpected. He gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, but the officer saw it. It wasn't a salute. It wasn't a command being followed. It was a mutual recognition, a moment where two people, despite their differences, acknowledged each other's humanity. The officer couldn't help but smile to himself. The journey wasn't over, but this small moment felt like a step towards something meaningful. Over the next few weeks, the officer continued to make changes in how he approached his work. He was no longer the man who only gave orders and expected them to be followed. He was becoming someone who listened, who sought to understand, and who showed respect to the people around him, no matter their role. He had learned that true leadership wasn't about imposing authority, it was about fostering an environment where everyone felt valued and heard. The embassy, too, began to reflect this shift. The officer's relationships with his colleagues and the local staff improved. Conversations that once felt transactional now felt more genuine. The officer would often find himself in the company of the embassy's support staff, those who cleaned the halls, served the tea, and handled the small but important details that kept the embassy running smoothly. He made an effort to learn their names, to engage with them on a personal level, and to understand their lives beyond the office walls. It wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. The Royal Guard, who had once been the symbol of the officer's misunderstanding, now became a quiet source of inspiration. The officer had learned that the Guard's commitment to duty was not just about serving the royal family but about serving the country's values that went beyond any one individual or position of power. The officer's newfound respect for the Guard influenced his approach to the rest of his work. He began to understand that every person he encountered had their own unique role to play in the larger picture. Each person brought something valuable to the table, and it was his responsibility to recognize and appreciate that. One afternoon, after a particularly successful meeting with diplomats from another country, the officer found himself standing once again in the embassy courtyard. He looked out over the garden, his thoughts quiet but filled with a sense of satisfaction. It had been a long road, but he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt when he first arrived. The walls of the embassy no longer felt like barriers separating him from others. Instead, they felt like a place of connection, where relationships could be built, where cultures could be understood, and where respect could be earned. As the officer walked through the courtyard, he spotted the Royal Guard in the distance. This time, the officer didn't hesitate. He walked over to the guard, his pace steady but sure. The guard stood as always, his posture perfect, his eyes forward. But this time, the officer didn't feel nervous. He didn't feel the pressure of power or authority. Instead, he felt a deep sense of respect, a respect that had taken time to grow, but that had finally found its place. When he reached the guard, the officer stopped and stood beside him, silently acknowledging the guard's presence. They didn't need words. The officer knew that their shared understanding was enough. This time, when he nodded, the guard returned the gesture. It wasn't grand, but it was meaningful. The officer had earned this moment, and he knew it. As he walked away, a feeling of contentment settled over him. The journey had been long, but the lesson was clear: respect couldn't be demanded. It had to be earned, through understanding, through patience, and through a willingness to change. The officer had learned this the hard way, but it had been worth every step. The bond between him and the royal guard was just the beginning. It was a small but significant symbol of the respect that had blossomed between them. In the end, the officer knew that the work of diplomacy wasn't just about agreements and speeches. It was about the quiet moments of connection, the unspoken gestures that spoke louder than words. And it was in these moments, these small but meaningful exchanges, that true respect was found.